Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new conversation in Moral Theology episode. This is a show sponsored by New Wine, New Wineskins, an association for early career Catholic moral theologians, and the Catholic Moral Theology blog. I'm Alessandro Rovati, and today I'm joined by Luke Bretherton, who is the Robert E. Cushman Distinguished Research Professor of Moral and Political Theology at Duke Divinity School. I have invited him to talk about his book, Christ and the Common Life, which was recently published by Eerdmans. Luke, welcome to the Conversations in Moral Theology, and thank you so much for being here.
Really a joy and an honor and delight to be with you, Alessandro.
So this is a massive book in a way that covers a lot of ground, a lot of political traditions, a lot of theological traditions. So it's not possible to go into all the details in a short conversation. But maybe let's start from this question. What brought you to writing a book like this one? What was the vision? What was the motivation? Again, what summoned you to this endeavor, which I'm sure was quite titanic, because this is not a book that comes out in an afternoon. So
that's true. It's a wonderful question. I mean, so basically, I've done a lot of work in the area of political theology in the past, and I think my previous work had not made explicit, or as explicit as I think was needed, the theological kind of grammar and framework. And so that was one dynamic of really wanting to lay that out there and render that explicit. The other was really a deep sense that as I'd been observing over the past decade, the emergent dynamics in our political context, both on both sides of the Atlantic, and obviously someone who's taught in the UK and European context and in the American context, and seeing the polarization emerge, the alignment increasingly of Christians with forms of either right-wing populism or increasingly intolerant forms of kind of left-wing politics, and the loss of an imagination for an understanding of a common life politics, or in Catholic terms, a kind of politics of the common good. And the parallels there with an earlier period, and I think there are strong parallels in our context with this, from the kind of 20s and 30s, when there were a flurry of parallel defenses of the relationship between Christianity and democracy by the likes of Jacques Maritain, of Reinhold Niebuhr, of William Temple, who ends up being Archbishop of Canterbury through the Second World War, and a number of others, Catholic and Protestant thinkers. We can see similar work emerging from Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others. Lovely, interesting book by de Lubac, actually, along these lines, or very little read. So that sense of the parallels with that context, and we were entering an age of hyper-polarized, paranoid politics, when the Christians were being easily seduced by different kinds of authoritarian movements. And there was a loss of this sense, a loss of a kind of sense that had been forged in the 20s and 30s, that while Christians didn't need democracy to be faithful, democracy enshrined key Christian commitments. And it seemed to me that was increasingly implausible claim, and various other ways of solving shared problems, or other rationales in defense of, for example, family, faith and flag. And here the kind of parallels with something like Action Française in France, where what you had was, in their explicit language, was they arose to defend family, faith and flag in France. They emerged in the 19th century, but particularly strong in the 1920s and 30s, and formed the basis of what emerges as the Vichy, obviously fascist Vichy regime in the rump of France. And lots of Catholics joined this movement. They were looking at communism, a kind of highly secularizing, anti-clerical, who were literally locking up priests in Soviet Union, and they were genuinely had proper fears of similar movements in France and concerns out of that, and a concern for disorder. And so they were seduced by Action Française as a entity which made no bones that it wasn't Christian, but was mobilizing Christian discourses in order to kind of recruit people, and saw Christianity not as it wasn't about the confession of Jesus Christ as Lord and the upbuilding of the church. It was a defensive civilizational project. So it was the mobilization of Christianity to a defensive civilizational project, rather than, and this is Maritain, who's initially seduced by Action Française and then comes against it, and gets involved in the emergence of Christian democratic movements around the world. On Maritain's view, it's the defense of the human and human dignity, and the proclamation of Jesus Christ as Lord is key to any meaningful Christian politics, and how democracy enables those two things in a way in which the kind of authoritarian and fascist or various emergence of highly intolerant forms of politics, whether on the left or the right, were disabling that, but at the same time seducing Christians. And I felt that we were entering a similar moment and needed to render explicit why Christians as Christians from different traditions needed to be committed to democracy as a commitment of Christian confession, not of practical necessity, not of convenience or merely prudential judgment, but there were deep theological reasons. But in that, needing to give, on the one hand, account of different traditions. I look at Catholic Church, Pentecostalism, various weird, not quite Christian haunted, Christ haunted traditions like humanitarianism, showing these theological logics. But also then in the kind of latter half, why for theological reasons you should be committed to particular kinds of democratic politics. That's not necessarily liberal democracy, but there are deep democratic commitments, kind of that Christianity is that enshrines deep Christian commitments.
Yeah, I'll actually ask you about this latter idea. You make a distinction between democracy as statecraft, which is probably what we usually think about, so probably a certain constitutional system and things like that, versus instead democratic politics. And again, you spend quite some time fleshing that distinction out. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that distinction?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very important distinction. And I think, again, it's not, I'm giving a version of it. I don't think it's not original to me. And again, a lot of these people in the 20s and 30s made the distinction. Maritain has a famous one, distinguishing between democracy as a system and democratization as a culture. I'm doing a very similar, but kind of parallel building on that kind of idea. And really, it's the sense that when we say democracy, most people think party politics or rule of law, bureaucracy, civil independent civil service or bureaucratic system. These are the mechanisms to achieve democratic ends. And so all politics involves, on the one hand, polity and a politics. And so the polity is the institutions and structures of governance and systems which enable the pursuit of these shared ends. So in the church, we have a polity. Presbyterians organize their polity in one way. Catholics organize it in a different way. Episcopalian, it's in the name, like we organize it in a different way. And so polity is vital for politics, but from the modern period, particularly we see with Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, very deliberately collapses politics into statecraft. and makes politics all about the mechanisms of the state. And that's captured our imagination and is a real problem, I think, for faithful political witness by Christians. Because then it becomes all about control of the state. Everything is viewed at a somewhat abstract level of a kind of national political realm. So we lose the arena of the local and the proximate as a meaningful political arena. And we lose a sense that politics just is about the negotiation of a common life amongst these people in this place at this time. And so you shouldn't conflate democracy as statecraft, which is about the mechanisms, with democracy as such. And to draw an analogy with banking systems, as we've just seen with the recent run on the banks of Silicon Valley Bank, etc., but it's a perennial issue in the modern period. If we can think about the mechanisms of banking, but ultimately money, banking, debt, it's all about trust. If you lose trust, as the denizens of Silicon Valley did in their bank, you have a run on the bank and the whole thing collapses, as we saw 2007, 2008. So for all my colleagues here, and they go on about economic systems, unless you have the relational practices which generate the trust through which a world of economic life can take place, you have no economic life. It quickly collapses, as we see with the run on the banks. And there's the same with democracy. A democratic system without the relations to make the meaning and purpose and character of it quickly collapses. And that's the situation we're facing in the States. The social trust and the relational practices generated through democratic ways of life and the social practices which generate those are running very thin. So take one concrete example, which we saw fundamentally contravened on January the 6th, when there was the kind of attempt to storm and overthrow the election in Washington, D.C. So we saw all the systems operating there. But the fundamental basis, one of the fundamental commitments of democracy is to a notion of this paradoxical notion of the loyal opposition. And that you can't legislate that. There's no system which can create that. It's purely social trust. I trust that I don't have to take to the hills or respond to the loss of an election with my AR-15s in a violent uprising, or taking to the hills and engaging guerrilla politics, because I can trust that I won't be persecuted, I won't be put in jail if I lose the election, and I'll still be able to act. And I remain loyal to the polity despite losing the election. Well, as we saw on January the 6th, there are many who've lost that trust in the system for whatever reason, good and bad. And so I think you have to have the democratic politics is those modes of relational practices which generate the social trust, which constitute the meaning, purpose, and character of democratic politics. And that's central to what Christians have lost sight of, don't have an imagination for, and are obsessed with partisan state control of the state, which I think actually undermines the plausibility of the gospel as good news. Because then it's all Christianity simply becomes an ideological kind of cannon fodder for someone else's political project at a state level, rather than at local congregational or diocesan level, the ways in which we generate politics as a mode of re-neighboring and thereby generating social trust through all sorts of different ways. So, in my street, when the kids in the corner are making a noise, do I call the police, which is I resort to statecraft to solve the problem, or do I have the trust with them? So I go out, say, come on, guys, I'm trying to work. It's getting quite late and my kids are in bed. Can we just keep the noise down a bit? Have I done the social relational work? Now I'm negotiating a shared problem, but through interpersonal social practices, rather than relying on statecraft to solve the problem. And part of what we're facing today is an over-reliance on state mechanisms, or only seeing state mechanisms as the way of solving shared problems. And so politics collapses into control of the state and competition for the state. And if you lose that, you've lost everything. And we don't have the relational practices through which a more democratic culture or life is made possible and plausible.
Yeah. It seems to me that there is a sort of vicious cycle at play where the more the fabric of trust and relational politics deteriorates, the more you think that statecraft is the only option. And the more you think that the statecraft is the only option, the more the fabric dissolves. So what are some of the counter practices in your view, especially as church, as Christians, that need to be put in place to resist, I think that's the right word, this thrust of our age?
So I mean, the first thing I'll say with that, because I think this is a very profound pastoral problem through which this kind of conceptual distinction is displayed. I think a lot of Christians, again, Protestant and Catholic, read their actual world through the abstract world of their news feed. Yeah. And so because they're all the time, it's about competition for control of the state, and whether that's the Supreme Court around abortion issues or whatever it is, the news feed determines the script and description through which they make sense of their actual life they live. So where I live, we're both in North Carolina. You're in South Carolina. I'm in North Carolina. We have this strange strange weather called freezing rain, which comes through and kind of like towards the winter. We don't have it in England where I'm from, and semi-frozen stuff, precipitation comes down and freezes, and inevitably the power goes out. And my cul-de-sac, there are all sorts of weird people who live there. They're lovely. I'm very fond of my neighbours, but they have very different religious and political views to me. And when the power goes out, we have to have a gas oven, and a gas stovetop rather, and everyone else seems to have electric. So we cook the soup. They do other things. I'm not asking their political views unless I'm the determiner of whether they. Now, I think part of the problem is, so the reality is, whether it's me picking up their kids from soccer in an emergency or cooking the soup, there are all sorts of ways we actually connect to people around us in these relational ways and restore the fabric of trust through which we can hold tension with each other at a point of disagreement, or disagree in ways that we don't end up killing, coercing, or causing each other to flee. Because those really are the only options. When I meet someone I disagree with or have a dispute with, I can either kill them, I can either create a system to coerce them so I don't have to listen to them, or I can make life so difficult that I cause them to flee or I persecute them. Or I can do politics. I can negotiate some kind of common life amid asymmetries of power and conflicting visions of the good, without killing, coercing, or causing to flee. And so when we have a disagreement, if there's sufficient trust born out of these seemingly very mundane, ordinary social practices of trust building and relating to each other without killing, coercing, or causing to flee, then we can engage in that process of developing a common life through dialogue rather than violence. So I think it's very, very mundane. The problem is, going back to one about the news feed, is if you're interpreting your neighbours who live proximate to you all the time through a news feed sutured into a national fight, you're going to not trust them. And it's not that you're not going to trust them. You're going to not be able to make sense of the actual world of trust you live in, and therefore are going to behave in ways that are counter to the actual life of you live, where you are enmeshed in trusting relationships with all sorts of weird and wonderful people. So I think part of the role of the church is, and it's very hard because when you're preaching, you have whatever it is, a few minutes in the pulpit, and Fox News and MSNBC or TikTok have a permanent news feed into people's synaptic exchanges and to generate deeply effective responses. It's hard to counter that. But I think one of the key responsibilities of pastoral work today is helping people see the actual life they live and not interpret it through the grid of their newsfeed. So that's one key thing. And I think aligned with that are those basic practices of mercy, caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, clothes, all the Matthew 25 stuff. And the church does that. It just can't see that is reweaving the fabric of a common life, which makes possible a politics rather than killing, coercing, or causing to flee. And again, it's being able to name what we're actually doing, the soup kitchen, these kinds of things, as contributing to reweaving the civic fabric of a world where we don't kill, coerce, or cause each other to flee. And then beyond that, I think recasting an imagination for a local politics and how can we come together with others to solve shared problems, or rather I should say shared issues rather than problems. The problem is capitalism, poverty, climate change. Like, these are problems you can't do anything about. Issues are, you can break problems down into issues and address this gun shop. What are we going to do about that? Is that acting responsibly? This bank, is it in our area? Is it doing responsible lending, or is it irresponsible subprime lending that's getting people into debt, causing family breakdown, suicide, whatever it is? Like, really focusing on more local issues as a retraining in, I think, a faithful political imagination, rather than this one dominated by national politics and statecraft.
Yeah, I think some listeners might soak in what you're saying, find themselves agreeing with it, but then have a sort of rebellion within themselves. That takes too much time, right? Isn't there an urgency? Isn't there a gravity to the situation? Whatever the reading of the gravity is, and there are many different readings of it, that we don't have time for that. We need the kingdom, and we need it now. Again, and the book reflects on this impatience that characterizes politics and humanity, really. Would you speak to that impatience?
Yeah, I think so. We have this, and it's, we can think of various, like the fierce urgency of now, and we've had various moves, particularly I think since the 60s, that kind of, I think, emphasize this kind of move. To frame it theologically, I think a properly Christian account of politics has to bring together, integrate three quite different kinds of registers. There's the apocalyptic register, which I think dominates contemporary political theology, whether the left or the right, whether liberation theology or more conservative forms of theology. And it's this sense of the kind of heavenly judgment on the present order of things and the way the Spirit is enacting change now, and the kingdom is coming amongst us. And so that's, I think there's no doubt that we need an apocalyptic register to make sense and challenge the dominant status quo. The world as it is not the world as it should be. We need a vision for a different world and a reading of this world in the light of the kind of a heavenly perspective, if you like, or in the light of the end of the coming kingdom of God, the eschatology. So that is one, but that can't be the only one. If we just have that register, we end up with self-righteous vanguards who think they can do no wrong. Everyone else is the problem. The sin is all on one side rather than our side. We are the bearers of the kingdom. And so there's a lack of ambiguity, a lack of holding tension with people. And suddenly you can justify death camps, frankly, on the result that these people aren't just wrong politically, they're a metaphysical mistake. They're not part of the kingdom. They're on the wrong side of history. They shouldn't exist in the world. There's a problem of being, is the apocalyptic view. This kind of being shouldn't exist, and we can get rid of it by any means necessary. That's driven, I think, a lot of revolutionary movements of the left and the right through the modern period. So we need an apocalyptic register. It just can't be the only one. But we also need a tragic register, and we can think of here of a deep vein of Augustinian politics that feeds into Augustinian theology that feeds into various Catholic political theologies, or on Protestant terms, something like Reinhold Niebuhr. And that attends to the ambiguities, the frailty, folly, fallenness of human life together in this age before Christ's return, and the sense that there's a limit to what you can do through politics. We should have a proper sense of any political project is laced with ironies and contradictions. But if we only have a tragic register, then we don't tend to challenge injustice. We accept injustice as just part of the way. We can't do anything about it. It can produce a fatalism and a passivity, or a kind of a baptizing of a deeply corrupt and authoritarian form of political order. And I think we saw that in somewhere like Franco's Spain, in Portugal and various Latin American countries. And that tends to draw on a kind of hyper-Augustinian, this just is the earthly city, you can't do anything about it. So you need a tragic register, but you can't have only a tragic register. But if you have only a tragic register and apocalyptic register, we tend to kind of not attend to what I call the pastoral register, which is kids have to be put to bed, plants have to be kind of planted, there's a cycle of seasons, there's the ordinary, mundane, in liturgical calendar terms, it's ordinary time. And that is a rich tradition, which I think we've tended to lose sight of. I think of Gregory the Great's kind of great pastoral texts. And that's a very important register. And it has a different temporality. It's neither the fatalism of we can do nothing of tragedy, nor the fierce urgency of now of apocalypticism. It's much more the sense of the cycles and seasons and warp and weft of life together as we raise kids, plant crops, do our daily work. And that, I think, actually is the register of politics as the negotiation of a common life. And we should be faithful enough to keep time with the pastoral demands of cultivating an ordinary life through time with others. And a failure to do that is a failure to attend to our creaturely existence as commanded by God. And this is the realm of prudential reasoning. You have the time to reason prudentially to good enough answers to collective problems, not, as in apocalypticism, fix the problem, why one size fits all, solution urgently engineered by a top-down process to fix every problem all at once, communism. So I think that's so I think there's a need to recover a pastoral imagination of the political as a crucial form of faithful witness when we've got either the dominance of a tragic frame or an apocalyptic frame.
Thank you. I think one of the beautiful aspects of the book is that you articulate the commitment, the threefold commitment you have just described, and then you put it to work in many ways by looking at different elements of our political life, almost again rereading them in light of these commitments. And one of the most striking results, I think, is your discussion of race. Right. Race obviously is one of the most, racism is one of the most clear frontal attack against politics as neighboring, politics as a common life. Yet you struggle with different modes of resistance and against racism. And I thought that was one of the most interesting, creative parts of the book. So would you help us see the problem of race in light of, again, that threefold commitment? Because, again, too many sides, too many times, even when it comes to that, we fall into one extreme without keeping the.
No, so that's a great question. Obviously, a huge issue. So in the book, I write this chapter on Black Power. I mean, it's a theme throughout, but I particularly focus in the chapter on Black Power, and really that was an attempt to respond to, I think, a lot of the misconceptions particularly in white audiences, of Black Power and kind of rejections of it as a form of reverse racism, or not being able to make sense of not really understanding the history of Black nationalism and what it was a response to and how that fed into Black Power debates, and a kind of narrative around, well, we had the good Christian civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, and then we had the terrible atheistic, secularized Black Power movement. So there are all these misconceptions out there. And I thought these were profound misreadings and misunderstandings that were really ways of avoiding, I think, the challenge that Black Power, and more broadly, a long history of critiques. Think of someone like Frederick Douglass, or even go back to someone like Martin Delany and others. Long history of critiques that African Americans in the American context had presented of American democracy and of democracy as such. And so it was important to respond to those critiques and learn from them about some of the failings of democracy as a system and as a set of social practices to address a systematic issue like racism and the kind of legacies and afterlife of slavery, which is also really a case study of how do you cope with, respond to the ways in which certain populations, in this case African Americans, endure for many centuries often systemic disadvantage, and how can a system cope with that, respond to that, and what are the resources of those in that situation to respond democratically rather than with revolutionary violence. And so there's a whole, I think, very important discourse there around that, where you have to constitute yourself as a people in order to generate the cultural, relational, political, economic agency, which is just another, power is just another word for agency, who can act and how to act. So you have the agency through which you can both survive and thrive in a world which is constantly undermining your ability to act with and for others and constituting you as a subject available for exploitation. And so I'm looking at the subjective and objective conditions of disadvantage mobilized through racialized structures and cultures, or racist systems and cultures. So to use the apocalyptic, tragic, pastoral frame, so we have obviously a need for an apocalyptic judgment against, as some have raised and I draw out in the book, a kind of what's called a Herrenvolk democracy, i.e. a democracy where the people, we the people, is constituted through a racialized and racist structure, in this case whiteness. And so there needs to be a judgment against that. But equally, if we just have this kind of friend-enemy distinction, whereby we make an absolute binary between black and white, and there can be no common life between them, we see this with certain things like Afro-pessimism. There's just an ontological division between blacks and whites that is central to the modern world. This is the kind of Afro-pessimist line. Then you can't do politics. There can be no common life. So yes, you need an apocalyptic judgment, a strong and vocal and powerful prophetic denunciation of the ways in which white supremacy is not simply an accident or side feature, but constitutive of American democracy. And I'm just talking about America in this instance. But you also need a tragic sensibility. There's kind of a sense in which there are the kind of politics of memory, the afterlife of slavery just do shape life together. What can we do politically? It's got to be involving changed hearts and minds as well as systems. There's no one size fits all solution to this problem. There's multiple solutions. And there are limits to what can be achieved. Barack Obama's not going to solve the problem. You can't have some messianic figure who's going to make it right, or messianic movement that's going to do it. So we have to have the apocalyptic, but also got to have a sense of the limits and possibilities of earthly politics before Christ's return, and the ongoing horror that will just be generating, we're trying to remediate, as well as the pastoral life of the formation at various levels, from the local to the regional to the kind of national, of points of restoring and enabling new forms of life, but also the place of then forgiveness, mercy, repentance, reparation, as relational gestures through which we reweave the possibilities of a common life. And again, it's not just reparation. There might be certain kinds of, think about what Georgetown is doing as a university. Those are a proper and right gestures in particular contexts, as well as, I think, something like Medicare, expansion of Medicare, which disproportionately benefits African American folk who've been systematically disadvantaged in terms of. So you need multiple kinds of responses of various vectors as part of this reweaving, even as we have to have a kind of realism about what can be achieved, and a very full-throated denunciation of white supremacy as its operative and constitutive of our current political system, economic and political systems. So that would kind of run it through that grid. In relation to Black Power, I look at, I close by looking at James Cone's work and Kirk Duggan's, a womanist theologian, and how they're drawing on scripture to locate Black Power as a form of exorcism of the body politic. But how, if we look at the story of the Gerasene demoniac, or Gerasene demoniac, there's even the one being exorcised refuses and finds as a threat the gift of exorcism. And so that this sense in which, in a body constituted by the demon of white supremacy, the thought of being exorcised and set free from it, even though it imprisons us who are practicing white supremacy, the mere opportunity to be rid of that demon is experienced as threat that is then resisted. And those who benefit from the exorcism in the story ask Jesus to leave. They're uncomfortable with this act of exorcism. And I think that's again what we see around us today. And this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s point, that racism imprisons the racist as much of, if not more so, from the possibilities of human intimacy with others, which is central to meaningful communion or fellowship, a key Christian commitment. But the thought of that intimacy, the thought of that fellowship, the possibilities of real communion are, rather than a liberation, experienced as a threat that are resisted by any means necessary by those who have so committed themselves into their imprisonment, self-imprisonment, that they name what is a curse as a blessing. And I think that is central to the biblical story of that exorcism. It's a helpful way of that Cone and Kirk Douglas give us of reading the current experience of the resistances to what needs all our need for liberation from that which prevents meaningful communion.
The book is filled with chapters that help us see things that are right in front of our eyes, but that often go unnamed. And you have a special talent for naming them in ways that then are hard to forget. You do that with the reality of money, of power. Again, the book is filled with different chapters looking at different facets of our experience. Since I needed to choose one to talk about, again, I love to talk to you for 3 hours, but the one on secularization really struck a chord in me. Not only because of a personal interest, but because, again, as a lot of the book, it just sheds light on something that after you see it, it makes sense and you cannot forget it. But beforehand, you were not quite looking at it. In particular, again, the secular as something that might be good for the church, that is constitutive of the reality of the church. So would you talk a little bit about your view of the secularity, secularization? You make that
Yeah.
3,
So no, it's a very important chapter, and it was a very important chapter for me. It's a lot of, I would say, it was as much a spiritual work as it was a kind of intellectual, conceptual set of distinctions. Because, and I would say a pastoral work. That chapter is born out of doing a lot of work in churches, Catholic and Protestant, both in the UK and here, and realizing that so much of the politics we see the church practicing is born out of either, I think, out of a reaction, a defensive reaction against kind of secularization, or a felt need to somehow embrace it and thereby self-censor core Christian claims in the name of somehow being culturally relevant, or you just can't say those kinds of things anymore. And realizing this script, whether as a defensive script leading to I think quite an authoritarian reactionary politics, or as a kind of baptizing the present and every progressive shibboleth that comes down the kind of line, they were driven by this over acceptance of something called the secular, which felt to me theologically completely unanalyzed. The people's operations was responding to bad sociology, and was deeply inhibiting faithful Christian witness. So I felt there was something spiritually very important at stake in that, writing that chapter. And it's, a lot of people have really responded to it, I think. So the kind of distinctions I make in the chapter is between a proper understanding of the secular, and this is, drawing straight from Augustine, as that which is not eternal. And so there is a proper faithful secularity, if you like, which is the church should be committed to protecting, of politics in this age before Christ returns as properly secular. It's penultimate, it's not ultimate. We can have political arguments that are not about the end of history. They're just about tax redistribution structures and how you're going to get potable water to the town of Flint. So they're very mundane, very ordinary. We can take politics down a peg or two. It's just penultimate. It's not about the end of history. And so, so there's a proper defense of the secular, which allows then for a hallowing of plurality and a space of dialogue and mutual encounter, where I'm things like freedom of association, freedom of speech, that kind of stuff. If I'm going to listen to you and we're not going to kill, coerce, and persecute each other, then we need certain structures and systems to enable each other to be heard, to speak, to be in the same space together, where you're not having to run away because you're afraid I'm going to persecute you. So that's the kind of account of the secular. What people hear when they often talk about the secular is either an ideological program of secularization, which develops in the modern kind of Western states, European states predominantly, as a way of controlling and managing religion and excluding religious discourse from public institutions or political debates or whatever it is, hospitals, universities, prisons, that kind of stuff. And that should rightly be opposed. That's an ideological program for the intentional exclusion of religious discourses. And Christians can quite properly critique secularization as an ideological construct, and we don't need to, it's just a particular construct. It's not necessary, it's not inevitable. It's a particular ideological argument we can have and need to deconstruct. That also is a distinction from secularization as a kind of sociological process, which is often travels together with secularization as an ideological program. And that is the secularization thesis, emerges in the 60s, that there's a kind of fundamental incompatibility between being modern and being religious. The more modern you become, the less religious you become, and religion gets increasingly privatized and becomes its own kind of weird segment of the world, which eventually disappear. Now, that's just bad sociology. Turns out, to use Peter Berger's terms, the world is furiously religious as ever. You can't make sense of conflicts in Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, India, the Middle East, America, the supposedly most modern country, without understanding the religious dynamics. That there are less bums on seats in church on a Sunday doesn't mean the world is becoming less religious. Religions change. It's a different phenomena. How do you even define it? There's all sorts of ways. A Trump rally, conspiracy theories are religious phenomena. They're no less religious in mode and operation than what we see happening in a church on Sunday. So religion shows up in all sorts of places. It's still constitutive of the modern world. In fact, in many ways, in many parts of the world, the more modern you become, the more religious you become. Something like Indonesia is a good example. Egypt is a good example. America up to about 1990s was a good example. More people went to church in 1950 than they did in 1850. So, we see this, it comes and goes, and it's much more Charles Taylor's notion. We live in these cross pressures. The analogy I use is that basically, according to the secularization thesis, we used to think that all of culture was moving this in single direction. It's kind of the showerhead model. Everyone would step into the shower and be washed clean of the foul accretions of their religious superstition and emerge rational men and women, released from the dull hand of tradition and the priests. That turns out to be an utter fantasy. We actually live in a jacuzzi. Everything's bubbling up from everywhere in not very hygienic conditions. And whether you're, Franklin Jr., Graham Jr., you're worried about and you're having to proclaim and be a sense of embattled minority, as well as if you're a confessional Darwinist like Dawkins, who's my fourth cousin, as it happens to be, and you're defending Darwinism and a kind of godless world because you're sitting in Oxford and you suddenly realize about 1989 that the world isn't becoming religionless, and actually there are all these mad mullahs running around and all these religious people in America, and you're terrified, and so you end up a kind of very aggressive form of atheism, kind of the Christopher Hitchens style emerges. So everyone is feeling like they're an embattled minority amidst the cross pressures of the jacuzzi and everything bubbling up from everywhere. So the problem is not secularization, but plurality. And deinstitutionalization. Religion isn't mediated and contained and authorized through institutional channels. It comes on the internet. People make up weird stews of their own, of different bits of, I have Tai Chi on Wednesday, bit of Catholic mysticism on Friday, and some kind of shamanism on Sunday. It's plurality and deinstitutionalization, and that shouldn't be a problem for the church. The church emerged in a context like that, and that's a political problem, but it's not a confessional problem. It's the problem before the church is always one of mission, and when we buy into and inhabit a script of secularization of either as an ideological commitment or as a bad sociological script that somehow we accept as true, then we are forced either into assimilation and giving up the confession of Jesus Christ as Lord, or a defensive reaction where we are de facto giving up the proclamation of good news because we're so busy circling the wagons and defending something called a Christian way of life. There is only ever for the church, and I think this is Pope Francis's point, the church lives or dies by mission. Unless you are engaged in mission, and that's a holistic vision of mission as the full proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ, as attending to the needs of the whole person and their dignity and fabric of relations which make life possible, then you're not proclaiming good news. You're in defensive reaction or assimilation. And I think that is a disaster for the church. One, unfortunately, many parts of the church are embracing as if that was the only way forward.
I would not be a good host of the conversations in moral theology without asking you about the chapter on Catholic social teaching.
Yes.
The book engages with a host of traditions. You mentioned Black Power. There is a chapter on Pentecostalism, Anglicanism, womanist theology, Murerista theology. So again, you are in conversation with so many voices and interesting perspectives. You do decide to engage with a full chapter with Catholic social teaching. And you do that in a way that in certain ways is novel, it's original, in the sense that out of the many ways in which one could describe Catholic social teaching, you focus on the idea of munus, of gift, the gift of the laity. I was actually present when you started working out that idea at a conference in Milan, so I'll claim Italian pasta to be the inspirator of this great theological insight. So would you unpack it a little bit? What do you mean by munus being at the heart of Catholic social teaching? Teach us as poor Catholics to understand ourselves.
Well, I won't claim that particular insight as mine. That's from Russell Hittinger and his insight. I kind of combine that insight with a number of others. And partly the chapter is born, I mean, it's funny, coming from a European context, and you'll know this, and it's particularly true in the Italian context, where the Catholic social, the connection between labor and economic life and Catholic social teaching is just taken as, second nature. That's just, of course it is. It's emerges out of the labor and populist. It's partly in response in the late 19th century, Rerum Novarum, and all the rest of it. And it was funny moving to the States because the story told about Catholic social teaching I kept hearing from bishops and others was very different. It was all about rights and freedom of religion. And I kind of thought, it seemed to be as if the main mediator of it was John Courtney Murray and his concerns, which is, he's an important thinker. But I just thought that's not quite the account of the reasons the Catholic Church embraces democracy within Catholic social teaching as a magisterial teaching commitment. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the chapter is lay out what I think is a kind of inner theologic that is at work, in which munus as the gift and office in the Latin translation, whereby we participate in the threefold office of Christ as prophet, priest, and king, through participating in our munus gift / office as humans. And the church quite properly came to understand that over and against a kind of clericalist view that only the clergy had the role of witness to the church, in the lead up and then post Vatican II, there's a recognition the church to be church needs all members to take part. And I think this comes to expression in contemporary developments of synodality as a kind of intensification of that commitment in Vatican II. There's a sense in which if I'm going to be fully human, move in Maritan's term from being merely human to becoming a person, and the transcendent claims, particularly with the natural law, but not exclusively with the natural law framework, to become fully human in relationship with others and ultimately in relationship with God, I have to fulfill certain transcendent goods of what it means to be human. Then I can only exercise and thereby become a person, exercise my gifts and thereby become a person in contexts of relationship. And that both entails both particular arenas of responsibility, the family, a union, a firm, in political office, that these are arenas through which we come to be as humans, participating in the munus, the larger munus of Christ, and thereby witnessing to our participation in Christ as the body of Christ in the world. And so over and against a kind of throne and altar sets of Catholic political theologies where the only legitimate agents were either the king and the bishop or the crown and the church, there was a recognition that we needed to defend society as a space for multiple forms of association through which people can exercise their agency / their gift / their mooness / their office, and thereby become fully human persons in relation to others, exercising and receiving from the gifts of others, kind of 1 Corinthian type model. And that was crucial to the full witness of the church. For the church to be fully the church, it couldn't operate with a kind of throne and altar, a crown and mitre model. It needed to have both political authority, ecclesial authority, and the authority of the laity exercising their gifts. And democracy becomes a means of that, creating the space and time and means through which people to exercise their gift. Now, I think there's other things, and I lay out in the chapter other key elements of why, as part of magisterial teaching, even though it's, John Paul II was interestingly critical of certain kinds of democracy, but it is a magisterial commitment that democracy, particularly democratic politics, as I talked about earlier, rather than democratic statecraft, is a commitment of Catholic social teaching. And I think that again didn't seem to be well understood. It was important to lay that out. I think it's one of the most fully developed understandings of democratic politics that's there. I wanted to make that available to Protestants. It was important. My own theological formation was learning Catholic social teaching and thinking with it. But also, it seemed to me the way Catholic social teaching was narrated in an American context specifically had somehow lost, I think, some of the richness of why democracy was a central commitment. There's other things I said, but I'll focus it on that.
Thank you so much. So let me close with one last question. The book is interdisciplinary. It draws from many different modes of discourse, but the heart of it is profoundly theological. There's a lot of moments in which you use scripture, almost a meditation on scripture, to sort through the difficulties of political life, with a tone that sometimes becomes quite intimate, spiritual almost, right? And so because at New Wine, New Wineskin, we try to help each other think of our vocation as moral theologians as a vocation, I just want to close the interview asking what the book did to you, again, as you worked on it, as you meditated on it. Again, there seems to be a sort of prayerful attitude in certain moments of the book. How working, writing, thinking about the book changed you, accompanied you in your journey as a theologian?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think two things really. Well, the danger of sounding trite, I think. A couple of things. The first is, I don't think I had really inhabited in my soul the absolute centrality of the theological virtues to politics. That politics requires faith, hope, and love. And democracy, as I close the book, drawing on Simone Weil, is a work of love. And that in the present context, the temptation is to despair, that nothing can change, the world is going to hell in a handcart, all that's good seems to be trampled on, and the venal seem to triumph. And at that point, I think writing the book and recovering the stories of the past, the theological riches of the tradition, and the very real ways people were struggling to inhabit more peaceable ways of life, it made me realize the need for the struggle to be virtuous as a spiritual struggle in politics. Otherwise, it quickly collapses into violence and persecution or whatever else is, because we lose hope. We lose the capacity to keep faith with one another, which is just another term for saying trust and reliable with one another. and we lose the ability to love each other as neighbors because we only see each other as enemies to be defeated. And so I think that writing the book both encouraged me in the cultivation of the virtues of faith, hope, and love, but also made me realize that now more than ever, take just the virtue of hope. Hope is the commitment that reality is ultimately determined by the life, death, and resurrection and ascension and future parousia of Jesus Christ, not by what's on my newsfeed or I see on Twitter. But that is a commitment of hope and faith. Otherwise, I will let my sense of reality be over-determined by a world ripped apart by violent and venal projects. So that's had a profound and continues to shape me personally. I think the other thing, realizing that in politics, one is all the time, and it seems to me political theology wrestles with, is it's both a site of deep wounds, and good political theology attends to those wounds, whether that's racism, whether that's profoundly exploitative forms of economic life, whatever it is, and tries to bring a word of interpretation and meaning making in the midst of those wounds. But politics can also be a site of wonder. Change can happen. Berlin walls can fall. People can repent of past sins and make reparation. Amazing things happen. Unlikely coalitions of seemingly people who should be opposed suddenly come together and do make life definitely better for other people in a specific place. So it can be a scene of wonder as well, of the Spirit's action in creation. And so I think that sense of both Christian theological reflection as a calling, I think, has to properly both speak to the wounds and not get caught up in, if it gets so caught up in abstractions that it's divorced from those wounds, then we have a docetic theology that isn't deeply attentive to life. But if it's just speaking of wounds and not speaking also of the places the Spirit is at work and evoking cries of amazement at the wonder of what the Lord is doing, then we are not speaking the good news. And our theology, I think, is divorced from what God is doing in the world. And so I think that realizing that the book is really, the heart of the book is that attempt to wrestle with politics as a scene of wounds, deep festering wounds, and a site of wonder. And what does it mean to speak a theological word at that site? And what is it to be someone who, as a theological writer, who can bear with both those crying out with a cry of wonder and a lament of the wounds? And how does that shape me as someone who can hear that and respond to that with a theological word? And that would be my word to my fellow theologians in New Wineskins.
Thank you so much, Luke. It was a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I encourage all our listeners to read and reflect on Christ and the common life. You won't regret. It's really transformational work. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. New Wine, New Wineskins continues its weekly Monday post on the Catholic Moral Theology blog. And I will see you in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. Thank you, many blessings, and goodbye.
Joy to be with you. Bye.
Bye.